Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. So far on the podcast, I've been mainly sticking to the topic of consciousness, and going forward, I'm going to be expanding into a bunch of different topics as well. So I wanted to offer a kind of explanation of the perspective that I'm coming from, so you can see how all these seemingly disparate topics interrelate in my mind. And the kind of cluster of topics I want to explore, I've been wanting to explore here for a while, but I've not really known how to come at them. And that's partly because they're so interrelated. And then I realized that the thing that unites them all is actually the concept of interrelationship or interdependence. And so I thought that's what I would talk about, and outline why I think the concept of interdependence versus separation is so kind of crucial for understanding pretty much everything in the world. So in the living mirror theory, there's a focus on the kind of partial separation, the seeming separation of life from its environment, that there's, life is still a pattern in reality, but it tries to keep its form together in a way that's differentiated from the environment. It tries to not slip into just dissolving into the rest of the environment, and that's what it is to be alive. So there's this concern with separation, and that being what brings consciousness into existence. But while there is this drive for separation, this drive for kind of individual survival that's at play in evolution, that's not all what nature is. Nature clearly shows this kind of this dominating feature, which is interdependence. The concept of ecology is a concept that relates to interdependence. So, an ecosystem is not some kind of top-down hierarchical structure where there's some kind of leader of the ecosystem who issues commands in this kind of vertical way from the position of power down to the subordinate levels. Instead, it's a kind of mutual relationship where complexity and kind of harmonious dynamics emerge out of this interrelationship and interdependence. So in Buddhism, as it relates to the mind, there's this concept of interdependent origination or interdependent arising. And so this applies to the kind of phenomena that make up consciousness, but also to things like the natural world, economies, any kind of complex system. If you think of an economy, it doesn't make sense to talk about the wealth of one nation unless you're kind of casting out in terms of other nations and the way they trade together. So the kind of wealth of each nation co-arises together because it's dependent on all the other nations. And in the same way, in the natural world, a plant is really nothing more than this process of life happening at the juncture of other kind of different phenomena like sunlight and gases in the air, gravity. You think of the way that a plant grows vertically towards the sun, its kind of shape, that it kind of has these leaves that act like solar panels to absorb kind of energy from the sun. All of this, all of its form, everything that it is really kind of shaped by all of these other factors in existence. So it doesn't make sense to think about a plant as existing separate from the rest of the universe. It's really necessary to consider the entire picture. And in this way, you can see how all of nature, all of life, is this kind of interdependent system. And this is also true at the level of subatomic particles. When we initially came up with the idea of atoms, it was this idea of separate little kind of building blocks. But then when you look down at the kind of fabric of reality at the subatomic level, what you find is there aren't building blocks that have their own separate pre-existing location. Reality kind of weaves itself in this kind of codependent way, where the observer interacting with the system makes it a certain way, because we are part of this kind of web of reality that is in every moment arising in this in a way that you could call ecological, in that it's this complexity arising out of these interactions. And with the mind, as this term in Buddhism was initially referring to, it refers to the fact that everything in consciousness is dependent on everything else in consciousness. So in the West, we might have an idea of a single experience. There's this concept of qualia as being these kind of single experiences that make up consciousness, and so you can point to the qualia of red, the single experience of red. But actually, if you interrogate that, you realize that there is no actual kind of red essence to the redness. It's only red in relation to the other colors that you can perceive, or the other kind of sensory qualities. And so there's just this interdependent web of everything co-arising at the same time and only existing in relation to everything else. So this is related to the concept of emptiness in Buddhism, the idea that things don't actually have an essence. Back to the plant analogy, to think we can apply the label to a plant and say plants exist, but if you really think there is an essence of plant that is somehow separate to the gases in the air, gravity, sunlight, the process of evolution, the life process, then you're fooling yourself. It's all just process, is another way of thinking about this. So why does this matter? You might think it just matters because it's interesting. It's a kind of fundamental feature of not only life but physical reality. But it also matters because in this mode of kind of horizontal mutual flourishing, there's harmony. It's a mode of kind of openness, reciprocity, where systems can kind of unfold in a way that's aligned with maximal flourishing. They can, by that I mean, they act in ways that are most suited to their nature. So a harmonious ecosystem, each component in it is doing the thing that is most aligned with its nature. Plants are taking in carbon dioxide and putting out oxygen. We're taking in the oxygen and putting out carbon dioxide. There's a harmony and a balance there. And this applies to our minds as well. In meditation, if you just surrender and allow the contents of your mind to arise with no resistance, no attempt to control, and a kind of lack of concern for your separation, you can realize that the separation is somewhat of an illusion and that you really are continuous with the world around you. But there can also be profound well-being, because it's in the trying to be separate from the world that's where suffering arises. And so there's real wisdom in aligning with this kind of mutual flourishing and this interdependent picture of the world at the level of your own psychology, but also in groups, in how we organize as these social primates that have to interact with each other. That can either be a harmonious, mutually beneficial process, or it can be one governed by fear and control and domination. And so I think it's really relevant at every level to understand this, where different systems are poised on this spectrum from mutual flourishing and interdependence through to separation. So why, if this is truly the way the world is and it's beneficial, why isn't it obvious? Why don't we all kind of see the world this way? Well, I just hinted at it there. Because we are these evolved creatures, because we are life forms that are concerned with perpetuating our form, and that is surviving, in addition to the kind of mutual flourishing and interdependence that allows us to exist, we do have this individualistic fear, this fear of dissolving back into everything else. And, we're programmed with this kind of fear of death, right? And that feels, from our perspective, very real and very important. But because it's been programmed into us, because it works for survival, seeing it that way allows you to realize that you don't have to be governed by it. It only exists because it helped us survive. It's not actually the be-all and end-all of the universe whether I survive as an organism, because I'm not going to anyway. So the sooner I can kind of get on board with that and not be unconsciously governed by fear for my own survival, the sooner we can, if we all do that as individuals, the sooner we can move towards this kind of interdependence and flourishing. But for most of us, there's some kind of trauma in our life, some situation where we felt less than perfectly supported and safe in this situation of connection and interdependence. And that pushes us towards the separation, towards the self-protectiveness. And this is what reifies the sense of being a separate self. And this is why, for a lot of people, there's a strong emotional defensiveness comes up when you suggest that the self isn't what you think it is, because their very existence, their kind of most primal fear of survival, is tied up with the sense of self. So you're really attacking the core of their defenses, even if you don't mean to be. Usually these things are brought up to try and help people, but it can be perceived as an attack. So what can also happen is, in the more extreme cases, when people face profound kind of trauma, especially when they're very young and they're vulnerable, they can get so ossified, so kind of encased in their defense mechanisms, that they develop conditions, personality disorders like narcissism and psychopathy. And what happens there is there's an intense investment in this concept of the self, right? And narcissism, this is why narcissists are concerned with their appearance, because rather than having this kind of open, vulnerable, connected, interdependent relationship with other humans and the rest of the world, there's the opposite. There's a closing off and an investment in this identity, this separate identity. And along with that, because separation is about control, it's about, at the organism level, it's about saying, I don't want to, walk into fire. I do want to eat that food. All of these processes you're trying to control your environment in some way, or control what happens to the organism in a way that's beneficial for survival. And at the psychological level, in a narcissist or someone with these related personality disorders like sociopathy and psychopathy, there's an attempt to control people around them, to manipulate them, and to dominate in some way, because that's what makes the wounded part of them feel more secure. And I think this psychological process is really at the core of the kind of the majority of suffering we see in the world. Now, given my background and my perspective, you might see this as a situation, of the way they say that to a hammer everything looks like a nail. So maybe it's not surprising that I think a psychological explanation is the right one for understanding where we're at as a kind of human community. But the way I see it is, even deeper than psychology, it's this fundamental life impulse of wanting interdependent harmony, but being unconsciously driven into separation and control. And we now live in a world where, unsurprisingly, the dynamics in human psychology that are concerned with separation and control and power, unsurprisingly, they're the ones that spent their time getting power and then dominating the world. And so we have a situation where civilization itself is a game that is constructed to benefit the people who are interested in separation and power and domination. Those dynamics are what brought this system into existence. And it's going to be a challenge if we want to move the human community towards a situation of interdependent mutual flourishing, unless we can actually center this concept of trauma and separation and come up with a culture that really, really values this perspective of moving all of us away from the pathological, neurotic, painful situation of separation to this one of mutual dependence. And even though the kind of dynamics in the world that are aligned with domination and separation, even though they're the most powerful, we shouldn't mistake this for being a situation where people who are trapped in those ways of being, we shouldn't mistake it for some kind of happy, successful way of being. They're deeply pathological coping mechanisms. There's a reason that narcissism in clinical literature is referred to as a disorder, and obviously the same as psychopathy. The person who is narcissistic, even though they might tell themselves a story that they're happy, there's this deep woundedness, deep struggle at their core and the way that they interact with the world. And so we need a situation where we want, everyone is actually concerned with their issues as well, so we can move all of us towards a situation of this kind of interdependent, harmonious operation, which, is the way that ecosystems work, other species seem to work. But because of our strange ability to dominate nature, because we have language and this level of intelligence, and we have kind of dexterous hands that allows us to make technology, we got on this train, which I'm sure seemed very appealing at first of protecting ourselves against nature. I'm living out here where there's kind of ants everywhere, and the idea of building a bit of decking to elevate yourself away from the ants is a kind of appealing prospect and might be something we might do. But that logic, where you initially do something like that, and then again and again you think, well, actually, maybe we don't want the ants here at all. Maybe we should put down some kind of pesticide to kill them. And then there's this kind of, obviously, if you were in a situation where there are actual predators and you get the ability to kill the predators, then that would be tempting as well. And you get on this kind of runaway train of fear, and you're living your life only in the service of fearfulness and struggle and trying to control everything around you. And there's a place for a kind of, wise fear and taking action. In certain situations, you might want to spend time today building a fence because you're worried if you don't, something bad will happen tomorrow. But there's a difference between a balanced situation where you have a kind of human community that can spend time healthily engaging in fearful planning, but can bring itself back to a grounded sense of well-being. And I think in mainstream culture today, we've absolutely categorically lost the valuing of this kind of peaceful, interdependent, coming back to being grounded in the present. Because actually, as I mentioned before, the whole reason I'm talking about this really is that interdependence comes with flourishing, comes with, in our case with human psychology, comes with feelings of peacefulness, bliss, contentment, which is ultimately what we all want, right? That's the value of existence, is how we feel, right? Consciousness is our kind of conscious state's the only thing that really ultimately matter. Everything we do in existence is to affect our conscious states. By definition, where there's no experience, things don't matter. So I think this is also why I'll be talking about psychedelic medicine going forward as well, because that is the lever we can pull that can address these issues in people. It's one thing for me to say, here's my perspective on the world. But if you play this video to a narcissist, they're probably going to dismiss it as some kind of spiritual woo, or just wishful thinking, or just not know what to make of it. And perhaps you're having some reaction as well where it doesn't feel like it aligns with your worldview. And the reason psychedelic medicine is so powerful is what I'm trying to articulate here is what I believe to be a common perspective that many people adopt or come to see as true after they've had certain kind of spiritual experiences that can be occasioned by psychedelic medicine. And so by allowing people to come to their own conclusions and have their own insights, if this perspective is correct, I see that as the primary way of moving us from a situation of separation, fear, control, dominance, struggle, neurotic suffering, through to a more equal, harmonious way of being. And it will always, there's no final endpoint. That's another thing that you can get from this perspective. Nature is a process. The world is a process. It's always changing. It's always an ebb and flow in different directions. And right now, we're way over on one side, and we need to move towards the ecological side, to ecological in a more abstract sense than just saying, I'm concerned with the recycling. Deep ecology is a term that refers to this kind of interdependence. So if you hear me talk about ecology, that's what I'm talking about. But we need to be, right now, I would argue we need to be moving towards this interdependent ecological mindset. But at a certain time, we may need to, the pendulum may need to swing the other way. And it's always going to be a process. There's never going to be an end point where we say we did it. Here we are with our perfect utopia. But I think it's pretty clear right now that there is a pathology. There's suffering that isn't strictly necessary. And it's pathological because it's governed by unconsciousness. The people in the world who are dominated by trauma and who harm others as a result, if they could see clearly what was happening, see their trauma, see how that governs their behavior, that would release them from the process. And this is why people talk about kind of consciousness raising, or people being unconscious, and bringing awareness to these issues really is the way they get resolved, because it's so obvious. You don't need someone like me to say mutual harmony, mutual flourishing is good. It's so obvious to us that it is, that if you're given the opportunity to take it, or you can see how you're not living your life that way, I'm pretty sure all of us would take it if possible. So going forward, in addition to talking about consciousness, I'll also be talking about psychedelic medicine, probably this kind of emotional issues to do with personality disorders, ecology, nature-based worldviews that I think are really crucial to this perspective. I'm fundamentally arguing for what I perceive to be the perspective that human societies seem to have before state-based civilizations. It seems most human communities used to live in these small groups where everyone knew each other, that were relatively balanced and egalitarian. And a key part of that was kind of plant-based shamanism, using psychedelic substances in a way that pushed people in the direction of ecological thinking. You would have a shaman who would act as the intermediary between the rhythms of the natural world and the human community in order to maintain this balance. And in the kind of Western story that's been told, all of that is kind of primitive nonsense, is how it used to be told, until people realized or were forced to acknowledge how kind of biased and wrong it was to consider other communities primitive in that way. And I think we now need to be moving towards a place where we realize this way of seeing the world, this kind of ecological spirituality, the kind of spirituality I'm talking about here that fits absolutely with science and with the natural world, where we surrender our sense of self occasionally and we realize that we can inhabit these wonderful, wonderful states where we realize the truth of our situation and we let go of our separation and our fear. I think that needs to be understood as a core part of what it is to be a human, especially a human in a society, because it's the mechanism that brings us into truth of our situation, but also into harmony with ourselves, with each other, and with the natural world. And if we don't do that, this runaway train seems like it's heading for ecocide and probably the death of our entire species. So not to end on a pretty dark note, but I think this truly is the core of our problem. And going forward, this would be, if this perspective doesn't resonate right now, I'm hoping, coming at it from lots of different angles, I can share with you why I think this is a really beneficial way to see the world. But yeah, for now, thank you for listening.